And I'm thrilled now to be joined by James Brooks Cascade, the state reporter for the Alaska Beacon, a wonderful independent, nonpartisan news organization. And James, you are based in Juneau, right? So, how much daylight do you still have this time of year?
We're over the hump. It's on the downhill now, but it's still a nice fall day. So we're going to enjoy it while we can before the darkness hits.
Yeah, come winter solstice time, you guys probably get very jealous of us. But okay, thank you so much for doing this, James, for making the time. We do appreciate it because we want to learn more about how ranked choice voting and open primaries have worked in other states. Before we get specifically into those election reforms, just tell us about yourself and kind of your experience covering Alaska politics, how long you've been doing it, and why you love reporting in Alaska.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely an interesting place. I've been a journalist in Alaska since 2008. I've been covering the state government and state politics, I'd say since 2015, 2014 is when I got into it in earnest. And it's just a fascinating place. There's always something new happening in Alaska, and you can be close to it all the time. It's the smallest state legislature in the country, and so you get to know everybody pretty darn well.
Yeah. To us that live in the lower 48, it is just a fascinating place. I can't wait to go up there and visit you guys sometime. But let's dive into ranked choice voting and open primaries here. When did kind of the movement begin in Alaska? How did it come to be that these were in your state law and now in use today?
It actually got started with an attorney here in Alaska named Scott Kendall. He was the chief of staff for independent former governor Bill Walker, and he started out by writing this, wasn't getting support from outside. He did get some funding once he started writing the initiative that turned into Alaska's ranked choice open primaries law, brought in another elections attorney, and then got the ball rolling from there. And then that was on the ballot in Alaska in 2020.
And so it passed once in 2020 by what margin? Or did it have to pass twice here in Nevada? If we're changing our constitution, it has to pass twice for us.
Here it was a statutory change, not a constitutional one. It just had to pass once, and it did so by a small margin, less than 1% of the votes altogether.
Wow. So 2022 was the first election when it was in effect for Alaska, right? Tell us though about kind of the nuances of the law there, which races it applies to, its final four, unlike, final five here in Nevada, and kind of exactly the nuances of this law specifically.
Yeah, Alaska's law is fairly similar to Nevada's. It's a Final Four system, starting with the open primary. Any number of candidates for a particular race can run, and regardless of party, the four top vote getters from that advance on to the general election. And in that general election, we use ranked choice voting. Pick one, pick two, pick four, or even five if you count in the write ins as well.
Hmm.
And then we do the tabulation and see who wins after that. And the winner goes on from there.
So 2022, the first election when this was in effect, how did it go? Because we are hearing a lot of different arguments for and against here, a lot of fear mongering. It's going to take many weeks to count. It's going to be complicated and confusing. Has that been your experience?
And Alaska actually got a shock start to it with the death of its longtime Congressman Don Young in early 2022. So our first ranked choice election was a special election happening on short notice.
Hmm.
And so the primary took place with 48 candidates all competing for that open
Oh
seat.
my gosh, you're kidding.
Yeah, and so it was including Santa Claus. You can't forget him. I believe he finished 6th when
Oh
all
my
was said
gosh.
and done. And so that went down, and then we had, Mary Peltola, the current US House representative, elected for the remainder of Don Young's term, and then we did it all over again for the general election, and Peltola won again that year. Somebody your listeners and viewers might be familiar with, Sarah Palin, was in that race as well. Peltola
Yeah.
defeated her and another Republican as well, Nick Begich, who is now running against Peltola again this year.
Hmm. Did the fears of it being too complicated or confusing for voters, it taking too long to count, did those things materialize?
Generally, no, but it'll depend who you talk to. If you talk to people who don't like the system, they'll say, well, there were a large number of exhausted ballots when all was said and done. People who picked just one candidate, their pick wasn't in the final two, so their vote was eliminated, their ballot was exhausted. They're still not happy with that system and how things are going. But by and large, polling seems to indicate that people found it easy to use and that it was effective.
Hmm. How long did it take to tally and release all the results? Something that I read researching for our debate that we're doing is that the ranked choice results aren't released until like the 15th day after the election. Is that correct?
That's correct, but that's a choice by the Alaska Division of Elections. In Alaska, ballots can arrive up to 15 days after Election Day if they're mailed from overseas and still be counted as long as they're postmarked on or before Election Day. And so the Division of Elections made the choice to wait until that 15th day till the cutoff for arriving ballots in order to do the tabulations. The thought was that while they could do a tabulation after election day and do an immediate sort, it might be confusing for voters because the rankings could change quite a bit as more ballots arrive and are added to the calculations. So, unlike in other states and cities, Alaska waits and does one ranking when all is
Hmm.
said and done. And I know there's lots of other places that do it differently. I was down in Oregon and talking to officials in Portland. They intend to do multiple rounds of tabulations because they say we think voters can handle it. And so it's really up to local officials on that.
Interesting. Yeah, and we'll point out, but that this will be up to Nevada lawmakers if this were to pass here in the Silver State. We don't know exactly how they would set it up, but in your case, at least, it did. They could wait until the 15th day after the election to find the ranked choice results. But it seems like in most cases, it is the person that gets the most votes in the first round of tallying that comes out as the winner. Has that been your experience?
It has. There were only actually fewer than a handful of state legislative races that ended up changing where where the person leading on election day in the first choice total ended up losing. And just a handful of those, and there's some of those candidates who could support the system, some of those candidates who oppose ranked choice voting, even though it benefited them, and it's kind of a mixed bag on that. But by and large, the winner or the leader, I should say, at the end of election day was who ended up going on winning. And
Hmm.
I should say that in Alaska, as in I believe Nevada's system, if somebody has more than 50% of the first choice votes, ranked choice voting doesn't even come into play. That person is the winner without going to rankings.
Yep, you got it right. Yeah, that's how it would work in Nevada as well. So, one of the thoughts of how this could kind of lower the temperature is that you'd have candidates that need to appeal to a broader share of the electorate, not just kind of the extremists on one side or the other. They need to appeal to the moderates in the middle to clear that 50% threshold. And the argument and the thought being that this would kind of lower the temperature because you need to win more voters and win the voters of someone who might not support you on their first ballot. Have you, I know it's only been in effect kind of for one cycle so far, but have you anecdotally maybe seen some instances where that has happened, where the elections are a little more civil, the discourse is a little lower temperature?
I think that you see that the most in races with close results, that we're gonna be close either way, and you see that particularly in places where multiple candidates emerge from that open primary. If there's just 2 candidates, obviously ranking doesn't matter in the general election, but if you have 4 candidates, a full slate in Alaska's system, then you see people really playing nice, I'd say. Back
Hmm.
in the US House election 2 years ago, we saw plenty of people remarking how Mary Peltola, the ultimate winner in the race, was very friendly, outgoing with her competitors. Sarah Palin even remarked at that, just saying she's so doggone nice, and didn't have a bad word to say about her. And that ended up working for Peltola as Begich and Palin, her 2 Republican challengers, really attacked each other and ended up not winning.
Walk me through how ranked choice voting played out in you guys had a Senate election in 2022, right? Where Lisa Murkowski, if I'm getting this right, emerged victorious. I think, at least from the national perspective, you're on the ground. So correct me if I'm wrong here, but the perception was maybe that someone like Senator Murkowski, who's a bit more moderate and centrist, might not have prevailed under the first past the post system that had been in place before.
And this is where the open primary comes into play because we've actually seen that kind of thing happen before. Murkowski actually lost the 2010 US Senate Republican primary and ended up staying in office because of a huge, unprecedented, at least in the last 50 years, write in campaign that got her on the ballot and kept her in office. And so, with the open primary aspect of things, which is honestly in some places even more significant than ranked choice voting, she was able to avoid a really contested Republican primary, go into the general election where her moderation helped her.
Hmm. As you say, by and large, it seems that most people are satisfied with how it's played out. There is this effort underway now. It sounds like it's going to be on your ballot next month to potentially repeal ranked choice voting. Walk us through how that came to be, who's pushing that, where that's come from.
Right. If there is Alaska doesn't have a far left segment of the political spectrum, at least not an organized one and not in any large numbers. So under ranked choice voting, under the open primary, the people who are disadvantaged are the far right, extreme conservatives who are unhappy that they can no longer have a disproportionate say in the Republican primary because under the old system, the farther right you were, the bigger advantage you'd have in a Republican primary and be much more likely to advance to the general election. And that matters in a lot of districts because the Republican candidate would be favored.
Hmm.
Now, with multiple Republicans advancing, moderate Republicans are favored. And so if you're on the far right, you don't like that as much. And so
Hmm.
that's where we're seeing a large push to repeal the system. They're very passionate, and right now, they seem to have the enthusiasm advantage when it comes to voting on a repeal initiative in November. Now, there's still a whole month of campaigning to go. The people trying to preserve Alaska's current system are extremely well funded and doing a lot of advertising, and they're focusing on the open primary rather than the ranked choice aspect. Because if you look at opinion polling, at least what's been released here, the open primary is still really popular. The ranked choice aspect doesn't poll as well. In fact, if you just look at that section in isolation, there's a greater number of people who oppose the ranked choice voting. But when you add the open primary into the equation, it's really close to 50-50.
Hmm. Yeah, we've seen that anecdotally here as well. Seen just a ton of Facebook comments. I'm all for open primaries, some people say, and ranked choice voting, no. And some people wish that it was split up. But proponents, of course, will say that these kind of go hand in hand. So you said it passed by a pretty slim margin in 2020, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so we know there's a majority of Alaskans, at least as of 4 years ago, that supported this. Polling shows that people are generally supportive. I'm not going to ask you to, predict how things would go, but I don't know. Do you think the political winds have shifted enough in the 4 years that you think there's a chance this could be repealed, or no?
I do. I think it'll be fairly close regardless, but I think if the election were held today, the polling indicates that repeal would pass.
Hmm.
Now, whether that'll stay the case on election day remains to be seen, but based on just the polling that we've seen, that's what we can say.
Interesting. Okay. Any other insights or things from, again, a state that has used this now for the last 4 years? Wisdom, insights, advice for Nevada as Nevadans are kind of considering this in less than a month's time.
A few things. One thing that came up 4 years ago was that the Alaska Democratic Party and the Republican Party were both opposed to the system. 4 years on, and having seen Democrats win the U.S. House seat, the party is officially in favor. The Democratic Party is now officially in favor
Hmm.
of the system, even if they're not enthusiastically in favor, I would say. So we have seen a change in that. Democrats who were opposed to it 4 years ago are now in favor of it, or at least not opposing it. And it's also been interesting to see the way that campaigns have changed as a result of the open primary and ranked choice voting. You see a lot of candidates entering races and then withdrawing to throw support behind a preferred candidate that they think will do better
Hmm.
in the ranked choice matchup. In
Interesting.
Alaska, yeah, in Alaska, we had a large number of Republican races where candidates withdrew in order to back a preferred Republican. That most notably happened in the US House race, where we saw the state's lieutenant governor withdraw from the US House race after finishing behind fellow Republican candidate Nick Begich. The thought being that Republicans are a lot less willing to rank multiple candidates. So they're worried that if there are multiple Republicans on the ballot, Republican voters won't rank them, and they'll be at a disadvantage if a lower finishing Republican is eliminated.
Interesting. Yeah, because you hear the argument that this eliminates the possibility of spoilers because, your second choice vote would then just be allocated to your second candidate. But you're saying that people are still worried about people not filling out the full ballot. They don't want to risk it or chance it, and so they just drop out.
Yeah, it only eliminates spoilers if you use the system as intended. And what we've seen in Alaska from the 2 elections that we had in 2022, and then what we're starting to see from the primary this year and potentially the general election, is that a large number of voters don't want to use ranked choice voting, and so the spoiler effect stays in place. Now, I think that if repeal fails and the system sticks around, we're going to see a change in attitudes even after that, because candidates will realize this is the system that's going to stick around. You have to convince voters to rank, but that's a hypothetical for the future.
Interesting. Okay, James Brooks with the Alaska Beacon. Really appreciate it. I thought that was very insightful conversation for our listeners who are considering this question three right now. So we appreciate getting some of your time and keep the faith as that winter solstice approaches up there.
Will do, Ben. Thanks a lot.